Hillary Clinton currently holds a massive advantage over Bernie Sanders, who's in number 2 in the Democratic primary, especially amongst African-American voters. And we want to give you a little preview of some of what she's trying to do to hold on to that lead and perhaps make it bigger in the future. So currently, an NBC-Wall Street Journal poll this month found that Clinton maintains a 54-point lead over Sanders among African Americans, which is very large. I don't know that you could find an advantage in any demographic category quite that big.
54 points is 54 percentage points.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Oh, yeah. Which means that, and look,
Not
going
basketball
back.
points?
Yeah, no.
He would need to sink a lot of three-pointers to catch up at this point. And that gap has been fairly consistent since Bernie Sanders entered the race. And he's been doing what he can to try to narrow it. He's spoken with representatives of Black Lives Matter. He put out a police reform bill that tried to address as many of the Black Lives Matter's platform as they can. But currently, it doesn't seem to be helping him too much. Now, Clinton is rallying a lot of very well-respected elected officials amongst the African-American community to try to continue this advantage. We've got some information about that. Clinton on Friday will travel to Atlanta to formally launch African Americans for Hillary, which seems like something other people should launch, not yourself. That seems a bit arrogant. But the group of black supporters started by Representative John Lewis, meant to energize, organize, and earn support in the community. She's also going to go to South Carolina to give the keynote address at an NAACP banquet in Charleston, where she'll speak about criminal justice reform. And recently, she also spoke with representatives of Black Lives Matter about their mission and what they can do and what elected officials can do to address some of the concerns of the black community over police brutality, criminal justice reform, and things of that sort. And she said, look, I don't believe you change hearts. I believe you change laws. You change allocation of resources. You change the way systems operate. You're not going to change every heart. You're not. But at the end of the day, we could do a whole lot to change some hearts and change some systems and create more opportunities for people who deserve to have them. And so she's doing pretty much everything she can to try to hold on to this lead, which, if she does, makes it incredibly hard for Bernie Sanders to overcome not the first couple of primary states, which have relatively small populations of African Americans, but eventually, once you get to South Carolina and other states, that will then kick in. And if he has not made the case for himself among that population, it's going to make it even more difficult for him to beat her.
Yeah, who would have thought that a 74-year-old white man from a state that has less than 1% black population would find it difficult to identify with African Americans?
Do we think that
I mean, he's spoken a lot about economic inequality, but he hasn't spoken a lot about economic racism, and I think that's part of the reason that people have criticized him, and that's part of the reason why he's not resonating. And you know, it doesn't. You know, let us remind ourselves that one of the key reasons that Obama got in was African American women who voted for him, and so clearly Hillary Clinton has identified that and is seeking to galvanize that base and utilize it. I mean, her husband Bill was the first black president. Let's not forget that. That's what he was called, right? That was his nickname.
Yeah.
So she clearly, again, she's kind of has a base that which she speaks to.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so he was called that. I think that, and there are dissenting voices who would say that he didn't earn that nickname. That many of his policies, not only later on, 10 years later, like with allowing Glass-Steagall to be repealed and all that, but the welfare reform that has had a fairly drastic effect on a lot of people in America, like those sorts of policies, maybe he didn't deserve that mantle. And Hillary Clinton is picking up some of the affection that people have for Bill Clinton, the positive feelings that they associate with the 90s, where the economy was doing relatively well compared to these days. And so she's getting some of that automatic support that I think she's now trying to make the case that she deserves in terms of her policies. But I don't know that she has really staked out exactly why she deserves it. And that's where I think that Bernie Sanders has a potential in. If he's able to take those economic inequality arguments, which I think that they should appeal to all Americans outside of the 1%, and show certain demographic groups how it also would apply to them and help them.
Well, not just also, but fundamentally apply to them. You're right. I think that if he can show that this is smoke and mirrors, and if he can find specific, or if she can't show specific examples from her previous positions. You know, it's one thing to say this is what I plan to do, but Hillary Clinton has a long record of things that she could point to.
That's true.
And if she's not doing that, then I think that Bernie Sanders does have an in there.
Yeah.
It's funny to me because Hillary Clinton, I would like to have seen the Black Lives Matter people get on stage with her and see how she handled it. But because she has Secret Service, we never got to see that moment. But we did get to see it with Bernie Sanders, right?
Yeah,
and so I thought he couldn't have handled it really better than he handled it. And then he appointed he has a black woman now, I think, at the head of his campaign. When I saw when we were in law, he was here for the rally
speech. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think he could get this done. I think that the reason why Hillary Clinton has such a big lead with blacks is because of they know her.
Yes,
they
that's
don't
such
know
a good
him.
point.
There's
yeah.
recognition.
And so
I agree with you there.
if he goes to South Carolina for a month and campaigns, I think he'll make a big dent. I think once people hear his message, I think he turns people. That's why he's doing well in Iowa and he's doing well in New Hampshire. And I think that he will, wherever he goes and talks to people, I think, again, it's going to be to get Southern blacks to vote for a Jew from Brooklyn. Not going to be the easiest thing. Okay, I understand that, but we have to the billionaires and the millionaires, and we have to go back.
Good. You just want to raise the volume about another 10 notches, but that's pretty good. I like that.
But you're so right. I mean, he's up until this point, I think, been something of like an intellectual darling, and he hasn't really been a man for the people simply because he hasn't been celebrated in that way. And so if he does do the right things during the campaign and meet with the right people, right, he's going to have more recognition.